All right, let's get started. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Andrew DeWeese. Welcome to Greenlight Law Group's Oregon Psilocybin Update. Today, we're going to give a brief overview of Measure 109, what it is and what it's not, and then, with licenses expected to open up in just less than a year, we'll discuss rulemaking and how the program is shaping up. Before we really get started, let me introduce our panelists today, Tom Eckert and Brett Mulligan. Tom Eckert is a seasoned therapist with experience in program development. He was the architect of Oregon's Measure 109, and with his late wife, Sherry, helped guide the campaign to establish Oregon's statewide psilocybin services program. Tom is currently the chair of Oregon's governor-appointed Psilocybin Advisory Board. He is also the chair of the advisory board's facilitator training subcommittee. Tom founded the Oregon Psilocybin Society in 2015 and recently established the Sherry Eckert Foundation, which aims to support equitable access to psilocybin training and services across the state of Oregon through scholarships and other supportive programs. Brett Mulligan is a litigation attorney who focuses on administrative law and general business litigation. He's here at Greenlight with us. Brett also advises and works on policy relating to equity in the cannabis industry and Oregon's emerging psilocybin program. Brett has and continues to volunteer on drug policy reform campaigns and legalization. He currently serves as an honorary board member for the New Leaf Project and assisted in drafting the Oregon Equity Investment Act. Brett also served as a board member for Students for Sensible Drug Policy International, and in that capacity held lectures and signature gathering events for Oregon ballot measures 109 and 110. So let's start things off today with an overview of the Measure 109 framework, what it is, where we have been with it, and where we're going. We're lucky enough today to have one of the people behind Measure 109 with us. Tom, in my experience, there's a lot of confusion about just what Measure 109 is and what it's supposed to do. And I think some of that confusion may be a carryover from cannabis legalization. With cannabis, we had medical marijuana becoming legal first, where you had to have a qualifying condition to get a card and access marijuana, and then recreational legalization afterward, which apart from not having cannabis bars yet, is a lot like alcohol. Measure 109 is different. It's definitely not medical because you don't have to have any qualifying conditions to access psilocybin under the program. But since the psilocybin is consumed in a controlled setting under the supervision of a facilitator, it doesn't seem, at least to me, to fit neatly into a recreational box either. How did you guys, when you were thinking about trying to pass this ballot measure, conceptualize how it would work when you were thinking about what could pass a vote?
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Thanks for having me. Thanks, Brett. Thank you guys for all your support throughout this process of implementation and also the nonprofit work we're doing. You know, it's been a long, amazing journey dating back to 2015 when we started thinking about how to do this. We thought deeply about not only moving something forward, but how to integrate psychedelics and plant medicines, and specifically psilocybin, kind of back into the culture after 50 years of prohibition. So that really, and our thinking on that really informed how we moved forward. And it is nuanced. I think that it takes a little bit of nuanced thinking to understand what this measure is all about. So I appreciate the opportunity to clarify. This is not a dispensary style legalization kind of model that you might be used to with cannabis. It is therapeutic oriented in that the idea is to create safe space under the facilitation of licensed professionals to explore this experience for personal benefit. So you're right that I wouldn't necessarily call it recreational, but it is open and inclusive in the sense that it's not based on what you might think of as qualifying conditions, whether that's mental health conditions or physical, medical issues. This is about your consciousness and using psilocybin to, however you really want to, whether it's creative, spiritually, or for therapeutic benefit. Now, the science is, really developing around the clinical benefits of psilocybin use. And that's absolutely part of what we want to support here in Oregon. But we're also moving a little bit beyond what the research at the FDA level is focused on, in the sense that we want to create a safe environment for a broad framework that can address concerns, whether it's kind of preventative or wellness or therapeutic or medical. And so that's a very nuanced platform that we have to create, because sorting that out is interesting, because there are particular questions and issues that arise in all of those categories. But we know, our philosophy is that that's doable and important, and in a sense can inform our narrative around mental health and wellness more generally. So we think of it as, even before you get to the psychedelic part, it's sort of revolutionary to move something through the Oregon Health Authority on a state regulated level that addresses all of these concerns on one platform and attempts to sort out this kind of integrated platform that can really help Oregons in all kinds of ways. So obviously a lot of detail in there, but that's the philosophy behind the measure. It's a wellness and therapeutic platform. And we're working on sorting out all the interesting questions therein.
That's fascinating. It really, that explanation, it really takes it out of the medical versus recreational paradigm. I've heard folks in the cannabis space say, all use of cannabis is medical. And I think what they mean is the ability to access cannabis has empowered people to take control of their own mental health and of their own health. And it sounds like that's exactly, or that's related to the idea that you guys had in making this.
Yeah, it's about creating a new space in culture for a new way of looking at wellness and mental health that retains the essential practice standards, safety standards, ethical standards that you might see in a more medical model, but moves it into a different frame that's more inclusive and looks at these issues maybe a little differently, in the sense that, why wait or only serve people when they've been diagnosed by a psychiatrist, but rather look at human potential and wellness on a broader spectrum that includes addressing mental health issues from a more conventional point of view. Psilocybin certainly has a evolving track record in addressing issues like depression and even substance abuse, substance use disorders like alcohol use disorders. So there's huge potential from a mental health paradigm, but those of you who kind of understand the psilocybin experience probably understand that, there's more to it than that, in the sense that the experience itself is really what facilitates growth and change.
Right.
And that's different than a kind of a pharma model where you're taking a pill potentially day after day to tweak brain chemistry to kind of tamp down symptoms. That's kind of the medical approach. This is more of a therapeutic paradigm, I think, because the experience is at the center, not the drug, but the experience, which obviously is moderated by ingesting psilocybin, but it's ultimately your conscious experience. It's your subjective experience. And that's why, to many people's surprise, but if you understand it, you get a sense of it, that psilocybin is what the medical field would call transdiagnostic in its efficacy. It kind of goes where it needs to go because it's your experience, and you're generating a flexibility of mind to address your specific issues, if that's the intention, or to just grow creatively or feel more connected, whatever the case may be. So it's super interesting from that level. And that was certainly part of our motivation to do this, was to kind of follow this more humanistic model of psychology in which the healing power is within you rather than kind of provided from the outside. Now, I'm not trying to create a kind of false conflict or anything between the medical model and what we're doing, because I think there's certainly a place for psychiatry and conventional medications, and those work in a lot of circumstances. But this is another alternative that very much should be brought to the fore and understood, and kind of find a place in our culture. It's kind of sad that it took so long, but we're happy to be leading the way in Oregon to shape that new narrative.
And I mean, it isn't the Measure 109 framework also sort of flexible enough to, well, let me back up. The therapeutic value of the psilocybin experience is certainly one thing, and that obviously you guys had that in mind when creating this framework. We've also seen, as you alluded to, a lot of pharma type research about what actually the molecule psilocybin does in the brain. And it seems to me, and we can talk about this in a little more detail later. It seems to me that the framework you guys have set up is maybe flexible enough to admit of those uses as well. In other words, definitely there's the framework set up where a person can go in and have a psilocybin experience under the supervision of a facilitator. But do you think there's also room within the program to do something like a daily dose, a small daily dose of a microdose, if that's found to be efficacious via research?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's not the focus of this model, or wasn't the focus as we developed Measure 109,
right?
Because we're looking at a supervised experience rather
right.
than a dispensary model where you come in each day to take psilocybin home. The experience is to be had at the licensed service center. But let me preface everything I'm going to say by, I'm the chair of the advisory board. I'm not speaking in that capacity so much right now. I'll let you know if I am, but these things are all being looked at an advisory board level, and the OHA regulations haven't been established yet. It's a process. The advisory board provides recommendations to the Oregon Health Authority, and they ultimately develop the rules and regs around this program. So a lot of what I'm saying is just kind of how I feel about things, and that's not from the chair board in any official capacity. That said, I was the architect and authored the initiative with my wife and with help from others. And our intent was to create space for these experiences, the full experience under the supervision of a licensed facilitator.
Right.
So that's the answer to that piece as far as kind of what the intention was. But the Oregon Health Authority will make rules and regs around dosage, around the duration of the experience, how long someone needs to be at a licensed facility during these services, and things like that. So, yeah.
So this is a great moment for us to start talking about the advisory board. Since this therapeutic model, for lack of a better term, with reference to the conversation we just had about medical versus recreational, since this therapeutic model is not necessarily a paradigm that we've seen in law before, we can't, thinking about it as a lawyer and as somebody who is very involved has been very involved in cannabis regulations, we can't just take the existing cannabis regulations or the existing alcohol regulations and apply it to this program, because it's really a different model. So how does Measure 109 contemplate that the state of Oregon will come up with appropriate rules for the program? You mentioned an advisory board. What's that board's role, and kind of what's it doing?
Yeah, the advisory board was written into Measure 109, the development of a governor-appointed advisory board, and is in the center of the 2-year development period that was also written into the measure. That was a smart move because, I think we learned from cannabis that kind of moving through things too quickly can cause problems. And we knew that this rollout was new, and a lot of eyes would be on Oregon, and it takes time to get things right. And so we included a 2-year development period after the measure passed to develop the program. And so how we go about doing that is through the appointment of an advisory board of public citizens who have expertise in different areas that are related to this program. And we kind of defined what some of those areas were in the measure itself, things like therapy, naturopathy, all kinds of disciplines, as well as policy experts and things like that, members of the public in general. And the role of the advisory board is to meet as a full board and also break out into subcommittees addressing specific areas that are in need of development to make this program happen. And that board was appointed some maybe 9 months ago. I'm not sure. It's been active for a while now. The subcommittees are very active. Some of those committees are the training committee, looking at how to create training programs for facilitators, licensing committee, equity committee to ensure equitable access to psilocybin services once this comes online in 2023, and as well as research and science. So all of those subcommittees are actively working on recommendations in their particular areas, and they kind of bubble up to the full advisory board, which ultimately votes on these recommendations. And those recommendations are just recommendations, and they move to the Oregon Health Authority, who ultimately integrates the recommendations and decides what the rules of the program will be. It's been a great process. The starting point was kind of philosophical and looking at these big questions around this program, and has over time distilled down to very specific recommendations in all these different areas. And I guess I can say the good news there is that there's a lot of alignment with the advisory board as well as the Oregon Health Authority, with kind of following the letter and the spirit of Measure 109. So it's really based on how do we understand Measure 109 accurately and create a program that's as safe as it can be, as equitable as it can be, that is focused on access, practice standards, ethical standards, safety standards, and that's what we're doing. So you can imagine there's a lot to talk about in that context, and it's been a very rich experience.
Now, hopefully we've got licensing opening up, like I said, in less than a year. What can we expect? When can we expect to start seeing some draft regulations? Are there already some maybe being passed around? What's kind of next for, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, we've got a whole lot of people who are really interested in participating in this program, and the sooner people can understand the rules and how they can access the program, the better. So what are the next few things that are going to happen in terms of getting some rules and final recommendations from the advisory board?
Well, the advisory board will kind of submit all recommendations by June 30th of this year, and then the OHA moves through a process. It's a very detailed process that includes public input to come to final rules and regulations. all of which will be completed by the end of this year so that licenses can come online in 2023. And that's kind of written into the measure that 2023, January 1st, license applications will be opened up. There are a few expedited areas, namely the training programs and the products, where we may see recommendations before that, because we need to get facilitator training programs on the ground this year, right, hopefully by this summer, in order to have license-ready practitioners in 2023. So we have to kind of line that up. So that's perhaps the first final rules that you'll see come into place, as well as products, because that needs to be kind of ironed out early before 2023 as well. But in terms of becoming a facilitator, actually applying for licensure, actually applying for to become a service center, that's in 2023, and that's when the program actually starts, and when you'll see services on the ground probably early 2023.
While we're on the topic of the subcommittees, I know you're chair of the training subcommittee, and one thing I've always found really interesting kind of in the application process is the advisory board wants to ask applicants about their commitment to entering the field and serving the community. So I was very curious, I don't know if, feel free to answer this with your advisory board hat on or just in your personal opinion, but what are you kind of looking for with applicants who, in demonstrating that commitment to entering psilocybin?
Yeah, I think we just, we all want to see a commitment to values that already known in the field. There's a lot of training around psilocybin facilitation for research and other things. What we don't want is kind of self-proclaimed healers, for example, or saviors. We want folks who come in with humility and understand the delicate nature of this work, that understand kind of a non-directive approach, meaning that, our job is to allow this experience to happen in a safe and affirming environment, and to maintain a kind of empathic, consistent demeanor that allows that to happen. That may not sound that difficult, but it actually is. It requires a lot of training to learn how to be with somebody and not get in their way and support their experience, to not interpret it actively, but rather clarify, reflect where needed, and importantly, know what to do when the experience gets difficult, or when difficult behaviors come into play that require some safety oversight. So again, this is about creating safety, inclusion, having strong ethics, and just understanding core competencies around facilitation. So these programs will be robust, comprehensive, will include a lot of perspectives on the work, which I think is important, inclusive. And I think that facilitation and the education around facilitation is really the heart of this program. That's where community is built around, and norms are built around the statewide program. So it really needs to be cohesive and well thought out, and that's what we've been working on in the training subcommittee.
One of the other major kind of aspects of the training subcommittee has always stuck out to me is the dedication to doing in-person, which I think I remember you're a big advocate behind that. I guess, what do you think are going to be the benefits of creating that in-person training requirement? And then how do you think facilities are going to be able to navigate that despite the ongoing pandemic?
Yeah, I think in-person is important as a slice of the pie in training. Certainly a lot can be done online. A lot of the didactic work can be done online. But the in-person requirement, which will be a percentage, and again, these are not final rules, but these are some of the recommendations coming out of the training committee. I think that's important to root programs in Oregon, first of all. And, this practice of psilocybin facilitation is an in-person practice. So the idea of not having any in-person oversight and working in that way seems not optimal. And I also think that the programs really need to know and connect with each individual student, because this is a new role in the culture, and it's an important one. And it's one that we have to mature into, if you know what I mean. It's not something that is like, take a test and you're good. And this is about relationships and understanding the maturity level of students as they come into this practice, so that they can sit with folks that are in perhaps the most delicate space of their lives, right? This is, so you could make an argument that a lot can be done online, and that's fine. But for me, I feel like it's an important component to have that in-person education, experiential training, and really relationship building between students and educators, as well as the student body themselves, as they develop community as becoming the leaders in this field. And all eyes are on Oregon, so we want to get this right.
I am curious when it comes to we were talking about kind of students receiving their education, the practicum training requirements that you guys have recommended. Obviously, I think one day, once there are people who are trained, they can eventually kind of just intern with students, kind of just walk them through a treatment session. But until there's experienced facilitators doing that, what do you think the practicum training is going to look like or consist of?
Yeah, it's a tricky question, the pre-2023 question around practicum, because once we have service centers on the ground, there will be training sites, practicum sites, we call them. And that is part of the, what we expect to be part of the training programs, is actual on-hand, experiential training using psilocybin, working with supervisors to perform the services. And that can be done at licensed service centers that kind of are identified as practicum training sites. And I know there's some interest in the community to create those sites. And all of that makes pretty good sense post 2023. Pre-2023, it's an open question. The current recommendation is fairly general, but maybe necessary, in that it says that training programs will need to identify kind of how they will go about creating a practicum experience or education that approximates what can happen post 2023. And kind of be creative in that sense, whether it's partnering with facilities, doing other things like ketamine, or going out of the country to do retreats where it's legal. It's not going to be consistent with Measure 109 to kind of develop practicums that are working outside of legality at this point. So we are looking forward to 2023 when that problem is resolved. Until then, we have to be a bit creative, and there's good discussion around how we might do that. It's an open question at this point.
Gotcha. And one kind of, I don't know if I'd say point of confusion, but listening to advisory boards, there's kind of been this narrative about a clinical versus non-clinical facilitator track. Are there any recommendations out there really kind of advocating for those separate tracks? And do you kind of agree with having those different tracks, or do you see problems kind of giving labels to different type of facilitators?
Yeah, there was a fair amount of conversation in the training subcommittee about this. The recommendation coming out of the training subcommittee was that we not separate licenses, that we don't have different licenses for different tracks, that there's one psilocybin facilitator license. I think that makes sense, because the core requirements to sitting with someone and working with someone are across the board, and they're kind of unique. And everyone needs that education. But it does bring out a good question around scope of practice. And this is really key to how we train facilitators and how facilitators practice once licensed. And also potentially in the code of ethics. Like, I think it should be, scope of practice should be front and central. So in other words, we need to train students to understand kind of what services are in their wheelhouse and what's not. And that gets into prior credentialing. So if you're a psychologist and you also get a license, first let's back up. This is a standalone license to become a psilocybin facilitator. It's not based on another license. So the license to become a facilitator carves out this space for the kind of identifying the skills involved to do the kind of core facilitation. If you have other competencies, as evidenced by other licenses, psychology, medicine, then your scope of practice, of course, includes the competencies that are involved in your other license. So in other words, you may facilitate a psilocybin session and contextualize it in a more psychotherapeutic context. If you're a psychologist, you can go on doing integration based on those competencies. So as you can see, that's important to sort out and ensure that facilitators are working within their scope of practice. But there is the training to become a facilitator is open to anyone with kind of heart and disposition and discipline to do the work. And that will open up a level of practice for anyone who wants to get involved.
And Tom, is there, so when people come to a facilitator and want to access psilocybin under their supervision, is there going to be a screening a program in place or some type of screening to understand whether or not that facilitator is the appropriate facilitator for a given person?
Yeah, that's right. So the course of these services include intake and preparation, then the administration of psilocybin on a different day, and then integration sessions afterwards, potentially. That first session is super important. You're developing a relationship with the participant, and you are taking in a client information sheet where they're self-disclosing things about themselves. And then there's a screening and evaluation process. The details of that are not fully ironed out. There's some consensus that safety planning is important, and part of that safety planning is including scope of practice, knowing when to refer, just understanding, ensuring that you're the right facilitator for the particular participant. It's a really rich discussion. I'm not going to say too much more about it because it's still in flow, and this is part of what we're looking at now. But I can assure you that that's top of mind, is how to ensure proper safety planning, scope of practice, potential screening tools, things like that.
What about, and this may be a hot button question, so if you'd like to defer, no problem. But what about a scenario where someone comes in to a facilitator and fills out whatever application there is, or gives them whatever information they're going to give them, and then the facilitator says, I'm not the right facilitator for you. Mm-hmm. And then that person goes to a different facilitator and they say, well, maybe if I answer these questions differently, this person can take me on. Is there any discussion around that topic, and without sharing of data between folks? Anything like that going on? I don't know enough about it to know whether or not it's a good idea or not a good idea, but I imagine that scenario could occur.
Absolutely. It's a valid, good question. This is at root an informed consent model. So, one of the key components is that we're sharing the risks with participants, and on some level, they need to take that in, and it'll certainly be discussed in full with potential participants so they understand those risks. So there is responsibility on the side of the participant or the client.
Right.
In cases where a client is not presenting, is kind of guarding their presentation so that they can access the services. I think facilitators will develop skills to kind of understand that as best they can. There may be more objective screening tools, questionnaires, things like that, that can ferret certain things out. But really at root, it's an informed consent model, and it's, you know, up to the participants to understand the risks as well. Facilitators will always have the ability to say that this is not feeling right to me, and that's important. I think both the facilitator and the participant need to feel good about moving forward before going into a psilocybin session. Mm-hmm. And so there's a fair amount that goes into that evaluation of goodness and fit. And that's kind of how we see it at this point.
Okay. When the as we get closer to having approved training programs, can you say anything about the criteria that's likely going to be in place to have an approved training program for facilitators?
Yeah. Well, a lot. You know, we passed something like 70 recommendations regarding what would be required of training programs to be approved. Again, these are recommendations, not final rules from the OHA. So we will see what happens in the end. But I think we're on a good track of kind of defining both the administrative requirements and the curriculum requirements. Most of those motions are around curriculum because there's a lot that we want to see addressed. We don't want to micromanage the curriculum, but there's a lot of important areas that just need to be there, and kind of what kind of modules need to be in place. Programs will be able to put their kind of unique stamp on things, but you know, again, this is super important work that puts clients in a very vulnerable position. So it's extremely important that training programs are essentially on the same page around safety and practice and ethical standards. So that is all pretty well defined in recommendations. Other than that, these are, you know, there's an opportunity here because these are independently approved programs. This is not a statewide, kind of a state-driven. I think there's some confusion around that. This is kind of top-down program, when in fact these are, you know, independent programs that can apply to become approved programs. So it's going to be a community, an education community, and I look forward to that. Look forward to participating in that. There's a lot of great folks out there that are developing ideas around training, so we look forward to the approval process down the road. It's coming up. We're hoping to have programs on the ground, you know, obviously this year, because we need practitioners for 2023. So the working date for final rules to be done and hopefully applications to be opened up is in May. So that's coming around the bend here.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Anything else we want to talk about with the training programs or facilitators before because I also want to hit, and this is flown by, so I also want to hit products, but anything else we want to talk about with facilitators or training programs?
We've covered most of it. Again, it's just so important that we have competent, you know, well-intentioned, ethical facilitators. I also, you know, just emphasize the need for community and cohesion across the state. And some of that is OHA stuff, but most of it's not. Most of it's about creating networks and support networks and communication in the community around training and education, as well as you know, services and integration support, moving kind of out of training into services more generally. You know, there's the frame of regulated services, but then there's all the potential support that can be around that in terms of integration, for example, because integration is a very general term. It basically means anything that helps afterwards, helps folks that had this experience to kind of contextualize it and use it in practice. And that can look like a lot of different things and should look like a lot of different things because people are different. So developing kind of a net of support around this kind of circumscribed, regulated program, but then have a net of support of people who are playing different roles to create kind of broad-based referral systems for support throughout the state. That's kind of my vision, is cohesion, community support.
I mean, it really was profound to hear you talk about how the facilitator paradigm is, the opposite of someone coming in and thinking there's some healer that can, give some top-down instruction to people. And, it makes a lot of internal sense how Measure 109 is set up based on that philosophy. It's really neat to hear. Well, let's talk about a little bit products. So Brett, you want to take it away on products? We have a few questions we wanted to ask Tom about what's going on with products, because like you said, just like we need to train facilitators so we can have, access to this program beginning in January 2023, we also need to get our products rules in line and make sure testing is in place. And so we have actual products in January 2023. So Brett, why don't you take it away on this topic?
For sure. So Tom, one of the big recommendations come out of the advisory committee is prohibiting the manufacture of psilocybin by chemical synthesis. Can you briefly explain to people who maybe aren't following the subcommittees very closely, kind of what this recommendation is about and what the issues are by using chemical synthesis?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the product side may develop over time. I think the initial recommendations are based on challenges around regulating lots of kinds of products, especially ones relating to lab development, and also kind of narrowing in on a starting point. And that starting point, which is kind of in line a little bit with the spirit of Measure 109, is using organic material itself, the mushroom, potentially in extract form, so we have good, clean, homogeneous products that can be, kind of dosed appropriately and things like that. So I think that's the thinking behind that, is just to kind of zero in on a product that we know we can start with.
And kind of related to that, there's another recommendation and again, just recommendation for OHA to start reevaluating product recommendations on a yearly basis starting in 2024. Mm-hmm. What do you think the OHA is going to look at as far as factors in when they do these yearly evaluations? And do you think maybe as like other states develop possibly their own programs or there's federal research, how that might impact what kind of products psilocybin facilities can use in Oregon?
Yeah, I really can't say. I can't say that the Oregon Health Authority will move forward with that recommendation even, so I'm not sure how they will look at it in the future. Yeah, I'm not sure if I have any comment on that.
Okay, and one of the recommendations I think is very interesting, and people tune into this webinar will be really interested to hear the answer about, is one of the recommendations was prohibiting psilocybin from being mixed with cannabis or alcoholic beverages during administration sessions. Mm-hmm. And I believe two doctors who were on the subcommittee voted against this. So kind of what are the safety risks that were the major concern when this recommendation got passed?
Yeah, good question. I think the general feeling is that we don't want to bring in what you might consider adulterants or additives that actually affect the experience itself, because that's not science-based. We don't really know what all is involved there. We're trying to keep this pretty clear and clean, at least to get started. I'm not saying that things can't evolve over time, but this is all hard work to get to a place where we can have a program that makes sense and that we're feeling good about out of the gate. And so, sometimes we want to reduce those complexities. And one of those complexities is this idea that we can add things to psilocybin to change the experience. Like MAO inhibitors, for example, or something you can add to psilocybin that accelerates and intensifies. Well, that would change our whole dosing understanding and the standards around that. So we want to start from a pretty clear and clean place where we understand the dosing. We know generally what that means. And, that's not to say we can't have additives that aren't affecting the experience itself, but rather create a product, for example, chocolates or something like that. That is a different story. It's more the recommendations, at least so far, are to avoid additives that change the nature of the experience.
Got you. And then, so this might be a bit of a hot topic issue, but one of the things you talked about kind of at the top of the hour was about psilocybin's really starting to show potential in helping people with substance abuse issues. So have there been any recommendations, Pastor? What do you think should happen if someone who, has an addiction issue that requires them to use something every day, if they show up to their administration session under the influence, I guess, do you think it's best the facilitator turns them away, or do you think if it's someone who has the daily addiction that, I guess, kind of like, what's your thought on that, if you don't mind stating your opinion?
Yeah, and it is my opinion, I think, and this may actually be in the measure itself, that, if there's inebriation of any kind at the session itself, that's probably a risk factor that should exclude someone at that moment for services. But yeah, I mean, all these questions you bring up there, there's things to think about, and we're going to continue to do that as the advisory board through the development period and forward. The advisory board will continue to take in new information, new science, new ideas to refine this program as we move forward.
Gotcha.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Andrew.
I was just going to say, it looks like we have about 12 minutes left in the webinar, and I would love to hear from you, Tom, about what you've got going on now, apart from the advisory board. Specifically, the Sherry Eckert Foundation is a wonderful nonprofit that we've been helping you guys a little bit with, and I'd love to hear you talk about the vision for that foundation and also any other ventures that you're working on.
Thank you for that opportunity. I always like to talk about the foundation. As some of you may know, my wife, Cherie, passed away last year in December. It's been just over a year now. Well, 2 years ago, December of 2020. So just over a year now. She was the co-creator of the measure with me and was just central in spirit to everything that's happening now. And when she was alive and campaigning, she died right after we won the campaign. So she was able to see it succeed, though she was not part of the development afterwards. But during the campaign, she spoke eloquently about access and inclusion, equity. And so we thought to develop a foundation based on her kind of clearly stated intent to support access to psilocybin services, as well as to training of facilitators, and to create kind of a diverse body of practitioners, and diverse in all sense of the word throughout Oregon, geographically, ethnically, etc., socioeconomically. So what we're doing is creating a foundation that's raising funds that we hope can be kind of a central fund that captures philanthropy nationally and here in Oregon to support scholarships for training programs, so that folks can overcome any barriers to get that training and become practitioners. Because we want, as I said before, if we don't have a diversity of practitioners and an inclusive outlook, and kind of getting into all the communities out there in Oregon, then we haven't done our job. That was what we're really trying to do, is get to folks in need in every kind of corner of this state. Now that's going to take some time. It's a big project, but the foundation is going to help with that. And part of that's raising funds and creating scholarships. Another part of it is kind of mobilizing community leaders on the grounds to help educate folks in different communities about this program in general, and that the fact that these scholarships exist and that you can access education to become a practitioner and kind of come back into your communities and make this program happen so that we can see healing across the board. So super important. The whole program is centered on equity. You know, it's a huge topic in the advisory board level, but it also takes, you know, private efforts. And this is an effort that I'm, you know, feeling privileged to spearhead.
Yeah. Thank you for that. And this is a little out of order, but you mentioned access and equity in access, equitable access. And that this is a major topic of discussion, obviously, in the advisory board and presumably in the equity subcommittee. What can you tell us anything about what ideas are being discussed in the advisory board and subcommittees about you know, increasing access both for facilitator training and for two psilocybin experiences for underprivileged or marginalized communities?
Well, I can tell you it's a topic that's at the top of our minds, and in fact, the equity subcommittee is kind of an oversight committee, and what that means is that it's part of all the other committees. It's not kind of separated out as an issue. It has liaisons in each subcommittee so that everything that comes through each subcommittee, whether it's training or licensing or science and research, is coming through an equity lens. So all recommendations are coming through that equity lens. Yeah. So, you know, that takes form in lots of ways. You know, sometimes barriers to access and inclusion aren't super obvious, and you know, folks who are really looking for that, you know, uncover stuff that we may miss. So I think that's a real important mechanism within the advisory board.
I thought it was brilliant when they decided to have an equity subcommittee member on every other subcommittee. I'm sure that's been very effective. Well, look, we're about 5 minutes left here, and I've never seen such an active chat or as many questions in any of our webinars. So let's see if we can answer a few of them.
I'd love to see that. You know, if you want to send a copy to me of the chat, in general, I'm always interested in, because I know we won't get to them all. I love to see all the questions that people have.
Yeah, let's try to do that. So let's see here. One person is asking, what are the planned insurance requirements for licensees and for facilities?
Oh, to carry insurance?
Yeah.
Good question. I don't think that's been decided or addressed at this point. That's a good question.
Someone asked, why are you opposed to microdosing under Measure 109? I don't necessarily see you as opposed to it. I feel like this is the program may admit of it, but it's not what it was sort of conceptualized to do. But maybe you can say more about that, Tom.
Yeah, I'm not opposed to it. I mean, I think it's always this thing where like you focus on something, and if you're not doing something else, it's as if you're opposed. You know, I'm not opposed to solving world hunger. I'm not focused on that either. So this measure was built in a certain way, and we wanted to get a certain thing done, and we succeeded in that. I'm super proud of that. Yeah, microdosing is super interesting topic. You know, the science is not as developed as it is with macrodosing. I hope it continues to develop, and you know, certainly interested in the evolution of those potentials. Just
great. I wanted to ask, somebody asked, is there any indication on how many licenses are to be expected to be approved for all types? Is there an overall limit? Will this be as popular, do you think, as cannabis consumption?
Okay, so limited licensing, again, that'll be up to the OHA, but I don't feel like just that's where it's going. I think that there's a kind of value around not limiting at least service and facilitator licensing, just to have equity and access to there are market, what that means to the market and how that plays out. That's a really interesting question, but I don't think there's an appetite to limit licenses. Will it become as popular as cannabis? Just a different animal. It's not a dispensary model. I think that, for example, with product development, I don't see that as being a market like cannabis because the need is so circumscribed. These are, experiences that are, the need. How much psilocybin do you need to meet the requirement of having folks have therapeutic experiences from time to time when it's just a small dose that achieves that?
Right.
So, I don't really see psilocybin product market as a big kind of gold rush type thing. That's just my sense of it.
I always kind of thought that, along the same lines, that probably with a couple robust products licenses, you could supply psilocybin to the whole program, at least initially. And then people started asking me about, well, I want to do a service center, and we want to grow our own, our own products. And do you think we'll see that, or do you think it'll be more a model of everybody obtains their psilocybin from a few licensees?
We'll see how it plays out, but you can stack the licenses. You certainly can have a kind of a retreat center or a center that is licensed to create products, to provide services.
Right.
Yeah.
I guess going along with that, one thing that I think about as somebody who, advises businesses on licensing is, what kind of barriers to entry do you think there are going to be for a product license? In other words, like if you want to have a processor license in cannabis and you want to make, hydrocarbon extracts, you just need a ton of infrastructure. You need a fire safe room. You need all this, it's restrictive zoning, local use regulations. It's high on the infrastructure meter. Whereas, to grow cannabis outdoors, you need a lot less infrastructure. Do you think that that there will be different endorsements for different product types? And do you think that some product types will be more accessible, for people who want to make products at a lower cost, maybe in connection with a service center?
Yeah, well, the measure is set up so that there'll be endorsements on particular parts of the chain, so to speak, whether it's cultivation or extraction or the creation of products. In other words, kind of taking psilocybin and turning it into chocolates or whatnot. So that is kind of how it's set up. That could expand, like the number of endorsements. So that was set up so that, the OHA could kind of decide where to start and then kind of increase different kinds of endorsements as we go and learn more and become more comfortable in all of this. And so again, I think, the OHA is there. It's tough for them to kind of create regulatory frameworks around a lot of complexities. So there is this kind of feeling like we need to start with what makes the most sense. It's not an attempt to exclude anything, but it is kind of growing in a healthy way, and not trying to do too much at once. Yeah. So I would just encourage patience as the program kind of finds its feet and begins to figure out what all it can do. And at a starting point, we want to start with what makes the most sense. And so there'll be kind of a limited scope of products in the beginning. That's not to say that that's where it will always stay. Yeah, I'm not sure. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, no, that definitely answers. Okay, let's see, just a couple more questions because we're over time already. Oh, yeah, this is a good question, I think. What discussions have taken place around how long someone needs to stay at a service center after administration?
It's not a question that's been discussed in detail yet. It's on our radar.
Yeah.
And there likely will be some recommendations around that.
Okay. And I guess the last question is something that I've thought about a lot. It seems to me that as a novel paradigm, the first place in the world where people can legally access psilocybin, new untried regulations, everything completely new. And the fact that in order to have a psilocybin experience, a consumer will have to, like, as you say, have multiple sessions, the preparation, administration, then I guess integration is optional, but at least the administration session seems to me that you'll have to basically rent a room, or rent a space at a service center, which is a licensed center, heavily regulated. And you'll basically have to pay a facilitator for, several hours at the least of time. So my question is, given all of that, I think it's not a stretch to believe that these therapies are going to be, expensive. Is the board talking about that and talking about perhaps ways to lessen those expenses to open access to folks?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We want to remove as many barriers to access as we can while maintaining safety. And but the OHA can't prescribe, cost. They can look at what they can do in terms of lowering barriers to entry and getting licensed and things like that. And certainly are trying to do that. The cost of services, absolutely, it takes, facilitators hours, it takes a service center to do it. And of course we're trying. I mean, the goal is that this can become above ground and people can make a livelihood providing these services as they are trying to do in the underground, but let's bring it to a place where it's accessible to everyone who doesn't want to go to the underground.
Right.
And when you compare, the impact of these services to what already exists, you get a picture that, relatively, what is the expense in comparison to ongoing psychotherapy or inpatient hospitalization or going to a substance abuse treatment center.
Right.
I would argue that it's going to be a lot less. But you're right, there's a cost. And that's why the Eckert Foundation is trying to step in. We're working on what it means to get coverage for psilocybin services. That'll take a while and I think will evolve. But I think with regard to insurance, and this is just my opinion again, when you look at the impact and on mental health that we're seeing in the research and the efficacy and the outcomes, and that this can be done sometimes in 1 to 2 to 3 psilocybin sequences, and compare that to the other alternatives out there. I mean, why wouldn't insurance want to cover that instead of covering inpatient hospitalization, substance abuse treatment, ongoing psychotherapy? So actually the economics work in the favor of psilocybin services. The problem is that out of the gate, it's unlikely that we'll have insurance coverage, right? So people will be paying out of pocket. That's why it seems expensive. If you had to pay out of pocket for all your medical costs, you know what that would feel like. So that's the challenge. But I think the horizon is that this is an efficacious treatment. We're learning how to provide it in a safe container, and that ultimately will be of benefit to Oregonians, not only from a healing perspective, but from an economic perspective.
Well, that is a great note to end on. Thank you so much for your time today, Tom. I really appreciate it. I learned a ton today. Just really amazing to have you on. Thank you, Brett, for your incisive questioning. Thank you, everyone, for attending our webinar today. We hope you come back, and we'll try to follow. I know there's a ton. The chat keeps going. It's incredible. There are a ton of questions that we didn't get to answer. We'll try to put something out on our blog to give some additional answers to the extent that we can. Thanks, everyone. I hope to see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.